Good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me okay in the back there? Okay. Well, first a lawyer, now an economist. You're gluttons for punishment. You will have a well-deserved happy hour at the end of this. It is my pleasure to be here today, and you got me out of the swamp. I live in the suburbs of Washington, D.C., so it's a pleasure to be here, and this is my joy to talk and think and research on these issues. So what I want to do in a short amount of time is really try to cast a framework for thinking about economic freedom. I think a lot of people in this room probably have intuitions and we believe that economic freedom is important, but I want to go deeper than that to give us a theological and economic defense of economic freedom and the importance of a flourishing society, because I think that allows us then to be winsome defenders and advocates of those things. So we're going to try to do that. And I am going to, this first slide here is what I would show to my students maybe in the first week of an economics class. And this is a picture of Wegmans grocery store, which I believe hails from New York. It's the best grocery store in the world, and that's not up for debate, in my opinion. So this is a picture that I did not take this picture. I found it on the internet, and I show my students this picture, and I ask them this question, which is, what do you see? And I ask them to pause and jot some notes down. And we see a lot of things here, right? I mean, and I'll ask them, well, give me some words. And so they'll say, there's a lot of produce, there's a lot of apples. If you look at the very front of the picture, those apples are from New York. So I suspect that this is a New York Wegmans, because when I go to my Wegmans, the local produce is right up front, right? It says Virginia apples. So there's a lot of variety, there's a lot of different types of apples. I mean, if you look farther back in the store, there's bananas, there's organic bananas and regular bananas. And then I ask them questions about the people that are in the store. And if you can see over on the side here, you have shoppers and they're wearing winter coats. And that seems just mundane to us, doesn't it? Because, we go to the grocery store in the wintertime and we wear our winter coats and we don't think that much about it. But it's really very profound, because most of us can't access bananas in January in our backyard. In fact, in the United States, we can't really access bananas anywhere. We import those bananas from climates and conditions that are more ripe for bananas. So it's interesting to understand and to pick that apart. And so this is kind of the basis of what I want us to think about. I want us to have an economic understanding of why we shouldn't, in fact, take this for granted. And before I move on from that, I really want to tell you a story, and then we're going to get to some of the theology and then some of the economics here. Does anybody know who Boris Yeltsin is or was? So Boris Yeltsin was the president of Russia after kind of the failure of Mikhail Gorbachev and the fall of the Soviet Union. And Boris Yeltsin came to the United States to visit then President George Bush in 1990, and he visited Houston, Texas, which is where George Bush lived. They went to the Johnson Space Center, which is kind of what diplomats do, right, when they go visit other places. And Boris Yeltsin was, milling around the Space Center and said, this is all fine and good, but we've done space. I'm not very interested. So take me to a grocery store, and you can Google this story. It's true. So Boris Yeltsin, the Secret Service made that happen somehow, and Boris Yeltsin is taken to an average, mundane American grocery store in 1990 called Randall's grocery store, still around today. And there's fabulous pictures on the internet, not sure if I included one here, of Boris Yeltsin, yeah, there we go, of Boris Yeltsin perusing the aisles of the grocery store. It's kind of like when you go to Costco today, right? And there's all the snacks out and you can't wait to see what they have next, and they're letting you touch things and try things. So Boris Yeltsin is milling around the grocery store. He was so moved by his experience in an American grocery store that he later wrote about it in his autobiography. He claims it's what turned him into a reformer. And while he's milling around the grocery store, he says something that kind of makes my, it just moves me every time I think about it. And that is, if the Russian people knew of this, surely they'd revolt. Because in 1990, The Russian people were coming out of 80 years of central economic planning and the totalitarianism that is a natural reaction and symptom of central economic planning. And so Boris Yeltsin, you have to think about who this guy is. He's powerful, he's politically connected, he has minions at his disposal, he has money, he has resources. You know what he didn't have? Jell-O pudding pops. They're not a thing anymore, but in the 1990s they were. And he liked Jell-O pudding pops so bad that that made him turn into an advocate for economic freedom. We'll take it where we can get it, right? Jell-O pudding pops are great, but this is a picture of him in the Jell-O pudding pop aisle, right? So but he's also overwhelmed by this because he says, the Americans, they're treating this as ordinary. He says he's both overwhelmed at the cornucopia of stuff that's available to ordinary people, but he doesn't understand why people aren't like running around, jumping up and down in the aisles. How often do you go to the grocery store and you're like excited about it, right? I have 2 little kids. I'm not excited when I have to bring them with me, right? Because it's extra painful. We have to eat our way through the store. So it's just also extra expensive, right? So I take it for granted and I should not. And I think that this conversation, it's been years since the fall of the Soviet Union. I think we thought that the battle of ideas, the battle for economic liberty had been won in the international arena and at home, and that is not the case. And if we're going to advocate for the advance of economic freedom, we need to understand it. And I think as Christians, we have a unique corner on the truth here. So that's what I want to do, is start with this really profound story of the ordinary grocery store and kind of lead us through the theology of how, as Christians, we can and should be advocates of advancing economic freedom. To do that, what I want to take us through is kind of some fundamental questions. The first thing I think as believers that we have to ask ourselves are, what is Okay, thank you. All right, better? Yeah. Good? Okay. So the first couple questions I want to walk us through are, what are God's design and desires for his creation? That's our starting point, right? So what is the story of creation, and how does it inform who we are, what our purpose is, and how do we think about the application of that in our lives in the 21st century? What principles in creation inform how we should live today? I think the story of Genesis gives us a lot of information, not just about the creation of the world, but our purpose in the world, and again, to reflect on that and import that into our lives today in the modern world. And then that kind of begs some of these are policy questions, but what kind of world do we require? So I want to really start here. Again, I could speak for hours on this kind of stuff, and I'm not going to do that. So I want to kind of summarize what some of the highlights are. But I think it's important to understand that the whole meta-narrative of Scripture is always consistent on this, right? So I'm picking out a few things that I want to highlight to you. But I think if we go through the whole of Scripture, we see this consistent story of our purpose in God's creation, our dignity, and our responsibilities to him and to others. So the first kind of thing I want you to think about, and maybe go back later and reflect on, is the first chapter of Genesis, right? If you read that first chapter, what you see is a story of abundance. You see plenty. You don't see cell phones, but actually you had everything on earth to create the cell phone. The most important thing being the brain between your ears, your human capital. That's how economists refer to it. So we're put into God's created order as the crown jewel of his creation, but everything in his creation is abundant. And we are to both cultivate it and enjoy it for his purposes. When we do that, we are glorifying God. That is part of our purpose. How does this manifest itself? We have to go to Genesis chapter 2. So I think this verse, in particular, Genesis 2:15, is very helpful here. The Lord God took the man and put him in the garden to work it and to care for it. This is an important verse, and if you look at the original Hebrew, these phrases are distinct and separate, and that's important. So to take care of something means to make sure it doesn't get plundered or destroyed, right? For its own sake. We want to care for. But that's not all God tells us to do. So he doesn't put us in the garden and then say, watch over everything I just created and make sure nothing gets touched, does he? Because he also tells us to work it. The original Hebrew word for work it is abad, and abad means to serve. So I want us to think about service as part of our purpose in God's created order. What does that mean that we are to do? We are to work. And I think in the modern world, we have a wrong perception of work, don't we? A Pew research study recently surveyed Americans, and it suggested that 75% of Americans are unhappy with their work. It's not really that surprising when work is our idol. And I think that we tend to think about work as only the 9-to-5 stuff that we get a paycheck for. But God created us to work in all dimensions of our lives. So we work in our families, we work in our neighborhoods, we work in our churches, we work in our communities, and we work in the marketplace. And all of those things can be put productively to God's service. But how do we do it? We have to figure out what our purposes are and who we are created to be. I think the problem with the modern conception of work is that we all work for maybe the wrong reasons, the biggest paycheck, the most fame, the best status, rather than figuring out what did God create me to do and how do I use that to abad, to serve. So our job is to serve, and our dignity is bestowed upon us because we are imago Dei, right? So it's not about our paycheck or our fame or anything like that. So those distortions in our modern culture, I think, lead us down the wrong road where work becomes a drag, it becomes unfulfilling, rather than what it's supposed to be. And this, kind of sin mars all of this, right? So you keep reading in Genesis and you learn about the fall. But it doesn't undo the commandment we are given in Genesis 2:15. God doesn't take it back. He doesn't say, well, you sinned, so never mind. We are to do it anyway. We are told that our work will be difficult and even painful, but we must press on. And what is the goal, the broader understanding of what is this? It's flourishing. And the way that theologians tend to translate this in the text is shalom. So when you hear the word shalom and you're reading scripture, what word do you think of? Peace, right? Peace. Peace is good, but I think it's a narrow and insufficient understanding of what shalom is. Shalom is a robust understanding and comprehension of what human flourishing is. So Jonathan Pennington is a theologian that has written a lot about the biblical understanding of human flourishing. And this is what he says. He's written a whole book on it, so just here's 2 sentences. But he says, shalom is human health and wholeness, resulting in strength, fertility, and longevity. The vision of shalom is at the core of God's redeeming work. So God's redeeming work in the world and your role in it is to bring about greater levels of human flourishing. What does that require? Health, fertility, longevity, strength. So those have everything to do with our material circumstances, don't they? So a biblical understanding of shalom then includes material well-being. It's not only limited to material well-being, but think about things like longevity. All the evidence shows us, and the major progress we've made over the last really 40 years, but beyond that as well, in eradicating abject poverty from the planet, that one of the first results is greater income and longer lives. And we all aspire to that, right? Longer lives means more time to abad in the here and now and making eternal contributions through your work here. That's what we're supposed to do. So we need a society that allows us to do that allows us to live into our purpose. Here's another kind of a verse, I think, that is helpful for us. Again, we want to look at the whole meta-narrative of Scripture. But when I think about the story in Jeremiah, the letter that's written to the exiles, right? Seek the peace and the prosperity to which I have carried you, of the city to which I have carried you into exile. If it prospers, you prosper. Biblical prosperity is mutual. It is not exploitative. It's inclusive. What does that mean? If we're serving each other, then we're both becoming better off. We are empowered. Other people are empowered. I think that's important. And I think the cultural narrative around this is wrong for the most part. So I think we need to reclaim what it means to advance human flourishing in all aspects of our lives, including our role in the marketplace, for those who have such a role. So there's a lot of weight that comes with that, doesn't it? But I think what it means, and if you look at this letter written by Jeremiah, it says, it doesn't matter that you're an exile, a stranger in a strange land. Imagine how that might feel. Pretty lonely, I suspect. But they're told, carry on. Raise families, build communities, build that city up. But for the city to prosper, its inhabitants have to prosper. One can only look to modern-day Venezuela and the devastation that, by the way, is wholly unnecessary. Doesn't have to be that way. To see that when a city is destroyed, its people are destroyed, and vice versa. We need each other. These are symbiotic relationships that we're talking about. We are social beings, and we need to find a way, again, to have a social, economic, legal, political system that encourage us to abide, to serve one another, not to exploit one another. And of course, because of sin, that's in there for all of us. It's a tendency, right? So we have to work on building institutions and laws and norms that combat against that. So I always say that your first econ class, if you've taken one, should have started with human anthropology. Most econ classes I don't think start that way, but it's my kind of mission in the world to change that. And here's why. Economics is about human beings making choices under conditions of scarcity. We always face scarcity of different kinds, and we have to choose lots of different options. There's a lot of different, options in front of you when you make a choice. So figuring that out is part of what we do all the time. So why not, then, would economics start with human anthropology? So I want to go through this, again, biblically informed understanding of human nature, because the society that we build must rest on the realities of our nature. If our society is constructed on a utopian vision of the human person, which, by the way, is the Marxist vision, the Marxist vision of the world requires human nature to be entirely fungible. And that's not how we are. So we need to start with our anthropology. What is it? Well, first, we're unique. This is not rocket science, but it's important. There's never been another you to walk the planet, and there never will be. There's a lot of lawyers, I'm an economist, there's lots of economists, there's lots of doctors, there's lots of teachers and coaches, etc. But you have a uniqueness about you that allows you to do that in your own way. And so I think our diversity is really the cornerstone of trade, which is a really important concept in the economic way of thinking. Because we're unique and we're limited, we can't do everything we need on our own. So we have to find a way to come into cooperation with other people. Here's another important kind of aspect of our choices and the way we're hardwired, which is that we value things subjectively. Human beings assign value to things. What that means is that as customers and consumers, we're going to come to the market with lots of different preferences, lots of different ideas about what we want, the way we want it delivered. And so entrepreneurs have to do what? They have to listen to that and figure it out. But undergirding all of that are the values of a society, the ethos. Because the ethos is going to drive what's on the table and what's not on the table in terms of entrepreneurship. So you see, every economic system rests on a moral system. And what system that is needs to rest on, I think, the biblical truth of God's creation and who we are. But this is important because what it means is we all don't want and need the same things. So we need some sort of economic system that's going to cater to different needs, wants, preferences. Here's the other thing, and I think when I'm speaking to people that are in nonprofits and people in church communities, this is a more maybe controversial statement. It's really not controversial to economists, but we're all profit seekers. We are all profit seekers. The way I want you to think about profit, I'm not going to write down the equation, so don't worry. But we do have a mathematical way of understanding that in economics. What it means to be a profit seeker is to seek leftovers, right? Have you ever gone out to lunch and it's more than you can eat and you get that beautiful little box? Now you have dinner. Leftovers are good. It's exciting, right? I think the most important margin on which we try to profit, though, is our time. Time is one of the most precious assets that you have. And I always say time is the great equalizer. Regardless of your income, regardless of your background, we all only have 24 hours in a day, and we don't know how many days we have. So economics is thus about stewardship. Stewardship. How do we allocate our scarce resources in the most prudent and productive way? That requires that we're good stewards of our time, our talent, and our treasure, which is what it means to be a profit seeker in the context of economics. Now, here's kind of the part that, we get worried about a little bit, right? And this is why, so I'm an economist. I have to show you at least one graph and at least one picture of Adam Smith, or I get fined. So here's my buddy Adam Smith. He's called the father of modern economics. Why do we like Smith? The reason I think we like him is because he understood human nature, and he started from there. He started from there. And what did he observe about human nature? He's a moral philosopher writing in the Scottish Enlightenment. He was watching the world about to go gangbusters in terms of wealth creation and economic growth. And by the way, he was living with his mom writing books. So he was kind of, he had the good life, I guess, at the time. But what he understood was that people have a self-love. They have a self-interest. And they're going to choose to do things that benefit themselves first. It doesn't mean that there's no benevolence, and it doesn't mean that there's no altruism. But it means that people aren't systematically altruistic in all of their decision-making. Now, another thing that I think is of theological importance here is that self-interest isn't necessarily bad. Self-interest is what makes you feed yourself breakfast in the morning, right? Your body needs the fuel. Greed might be eating, the whole box of Krispy Kreme donuts. See what I'm saying? So there's a difference between self-interest and greed. But self-interest is the mechanism of choice. It's the way we try to figure out what to do. Self-interest, thus, can and often does involve sacrifice. Sometimes you do things you don't want to do because it's better for others or your family. That can be a self-interested choice. And we even see in Scripture the reference to self-interest. I have Philippians 2:4 up here. Let each of you look not only to his own interests, but also to the interests of others. They're not mutually exclusive, but greed is exclusively doing whatever it takes to benefit yourself. Whatever the harm, whatever the cost. So we want to distinguish those concepts. What Adam Smith said is, look, we can take this element of human nature and we can actually construct a society around it such that we recognize it, but we induce people to think about cooperation. The institutions of economic freedom need to be there for that to happen. We have to have the right institutions and the right incentives. And when we can get those right, we can get a lot of, for Adam Smith, wealth creation, but a lot of problem solving. That's what entrepreneurs do in the world. They problem solve. And we need them to solve our problems because we can't solve all of our problems on our own. So then I like to go beyond the anthropology and say, okay, there's certain economic realities. And they are true whether we know the equations in economics for them, whether we read the chapter in the textbook, whether we understand them or not. It's like if I went to a physics class on the first day, I wouldn't argue with the professor about whether gravity is, fake news or really true, right? I would just say, this is gravity. I don't understand it from a mathematical point of view, but you're going to do that and help me. But if I ignore gravity, I do so at my peril, don't I? Which is why I don't walk off the top of tall buildings, because gravity's going to get me. Economics poses the same realities. And if we ignore those realities, we will construct policies and institutions that lead us in the wrong direction. So we must start with a knowledge of what these economic realities are. Here's one. This is directly related to our anthropology and the created order of the world, which is that we have, this is a word we use in economics or a phrase, comparative advantage. Right? So relative to other people, you are a lower cost producer of some things than others. But none of us has an absolute advantage in everything. So there's not one person on earth that's better at everything than everybody else. This is the cornerstone of trade. It's why we need to trade. Because we're finite. We are limited. We have unique skills that translate into our comparative advantages. And then we start to talk about this on national levels, right? We can compare that across countries. I don't know if you've ever seen this movie, but it's, to me, a really good illustration of lots of economic thinking. So if you recognize this picture, this is Tom Hanks, and this is the movie Castaway. I don't know how old this movie is, maybe 2004 or something. But it's a great movie about how harrowing it is to live by yourself. So Tom Hanks is a Federal Express executive. It's Christmas Eve. He proposes to his girlfriend. She says yes. Life is great. He gets on a cargo plane back home because he's somewhere on a business trip. A cargo plane means there's 2 pilots, him, and lots of FedEx boxes. And he crashes. And, the kind of ironic thing is the island is a place I would love to go for vacation. If there was a hotel and a restaurant and a Walmart, right, all the stuff. The problem is, doesn't matter how beautiful it is, he has to figure out how to get clean water every day, how to eat every day, how to get protected from the elements every day, but his core, kind of quest is get me off the island. And you know how hard that is? Because he's limited, he's finite. He would be much better off if he could walk to the corner of and go into the Walmart and construct a raft and try to get off the island. And the whole movie is about all these kind of failed attempts to get out of there. And it's immiserating. Okay, it's immiserating. We are interdependent. Interdependent. We need each other by God's design. We can't do any of this on our own, and we certainly can't flourish on our own, either as people or as nations. We need each other. We need our fellow human beings from every corner. But we need the right incentives, correct? We have to have the right incentives. So this is what Adam Smith's insight was when he wrote The Wealth of Nations, was how do you change the institution so that self-interested and sometimes greedy and always fallen people think about serving others, think about the common good. And does anybody know what store this picture is of? It was Walmart. Walmart's mission statement is interesting. It's save money, live better. So, a bunch of billionaires apparently care that I pay the least amount relative to the alternatives for my cereal. Is that because they're always altruistic, always benevolent, they're not prone to sin and greed? No. It's because it's profitable for them to figure out how to do that. And they've done that relatively well. That doesn't mean this is flawless or perfect or anything like that. But what we're talking about in economics is how to figure out how to find the most optimal wealth-inducing allocation of scarce resources in the moment. And the quest for that has been the quest out of poverty, and we're making a lot of progress. But we can only do it when we embolden ordinary people, ordinary fellow human beings like ourselves to do that. So people are not poor because they're lazy, because they're uneducated. They're poor because they're excluded from market institutions that allow productive entrepreneurship. So we look at abject poverty across the world. Those are the things that economists are thinking about. How do we fix those? How do we change those? So the cornerstone of economic thinking, or markets, are what I call the 3 Ps and the 3 Is. The 3 Ps are prices, property rights, profits and losses. Those 3 things go together. I think that the property rights are the cornerstone of this trifecta here. If you start to destroy and dismantle property rights, which is really part of the conversation we just had, right? Is there different ways that the state can kind of hamper property rights in exchange? Then prices and profits and loss can't work the way they do. And the reason that we understand prices are a good thing in a market economy is because they give us information that we wouldn't otherwise be able to obtain, and they incentivize different behavior, as do profits and losses. But those require the right incentives, the conveying of information, and appropriate institutions. So this is really the backdrop of economic freedom. So I wanted to take us from kind of the micro to the macro, right? So we're starting with human nature, human institutions, human knowledge, and what we're building to is trying to understand how to make the world a better place for biblical human flourishing. How to make the world a better place for the service of our fellow human beings. And I like to talk through stories. I think they're very helpful to kind of convey some of these ideas and the power of economic freedom. So, by the way, just to give you a sense of what I mean by using that term, economic freedom is something that is an empirical index. There's many organizations that do it. But Milton Friedman came up with this in the 70s. He said, look, we talk about prosperity all the time as economists. What do we mean? It's, kind of like a soft term. So let's do what economists do well. Let's try to measure it. So the Economic Freedom of the World report is put out by the Fraser Institute, and you can go look at it online, and they rank countries on a scale from 0 to 10. 10 being perfect economic freedom, 0 being no economic freedom. No country scores a 0, no country scores a 10, but what we're trying to look at is the level of regulatory burden, the soundness of currency, the freedom to open a business, right? The freedom to trade internationally, the size of the government relative to the size of the economy. So economists actually go in and measure this. So this is the backdrop of entrepreneurship and whether it's possible or not. So I want us to think about the real empirical difference in living in a society with lots of economic freedom like the US, or living in a society with very little economic freedom like the DRC or Ghana. Here's an example. So when I go to the grocery store, I already complained about it, right? When I go to Target or Walmart or Costco, wherever I'm going, and I get water, this is what that looks like, right? There's just a whole aisle in the grocery store, and the bottles are different sizes, different shapes, have different spouts, they have different labels. But I just kind of pick it up, and I throw it in my cart, and I go on my way. And I put it in my house, which is almost unnecessary because my house has running water in it, right? And a refrigerator that actually makes ice. So it's just extra. It's like the Jell-O pudding pops. It's just extra, right? So that's how I get water. The water that I collect is, I don't know, for a case of that water is probably like $5. And to get, even when I bring my kids with me in the minivan, drive to the grocery store, get the water, bring it back home, what are we talking about? 100 calories for me that I have to expend to do this is nothing. It's like it's not even a blip in my budget of time, calories, money. This is how my female counterpart collects water in the developing world. She brings her daughter with her. In many cases, she has to walk 4 miles in each direction, carrying up to 45 pounds, which, by the way, is the heaviest your suitcase can be at the airport without getting a heavy sticker. And she doesn't have wheels or an ergonomic handle. And she needs help, so she brings her daughters with her. So what limited educational opportunities are available in those villages, the daughters are excluded from. The shocking thing about this is a demographic that's living in absolute poverty, which is defined by the World Bank as living under $2 a day. People who are engaged in this type of water collection run out of calories before they run out of money. So just doing this can cost 4,000, 5,000, 6,000 calories. If you were going to go run a marathon or half marathon and expend that many calories, what would you do? You would eat a lot of carbs, eat some protein, eat some fat. You'd be ready for that race. That's not an option here, right? This is a fellow human being made in the image of God who has unique skills and talents. I think the problem here is that she is limited from developing and cultivating those skills and talents because she's stuck with a water collection that must repeat itself day in and day out. And this is how she's serving her family. She's living into what God's asking her to do, but she would be freed by the Walmart or the Target or the Costco, just like I'm freed by all those things. It liberates my time and allows me to serve God in unique ways that He created me to do. That's the point here. We want to include people in those opportunities that have been excluded from. So I promised you a graph. Here it is, and I'm gonna end on this stuff here. There's a lot going on in this graph. If you're not a graph person, just bear with me. So this is GDP is a way we measure national income. So just that's what that means. And what we're doing here is looking at global GDP over all of human history. So there's, like I said, a lot. I want you to pay attention to the orange line. Economists call this the hockey stick curve. So for most of human history, so we have AD 1, to about now, the orange curve was kind of resting on that horizontal axis. And by all kind of economist estimates, people lived on between $1 and $3 a day for all of that time. So very few people made it out of that, and people lived very short lives. Early death, death in childbirth, children not making it past their 5th birthdays, very common phenomenon. And then something happened, and when I ask my students what happened, they say, the Industrial Revolution happened, which is right, it's correct, But what made the Industrial Revolution happen? Maybe I'll come back and talk about that another day, because it's an interesting question. But I think part of what enabled the Industrial Revolution to happen is the ethos of work as service. The ethos of entrepreneurship being good for its own sake, because it's a way to problem solve, to discover better ways of doing things that improve the lives of all of us. So you and I are born in the handle of that hockey stick through no doing of our own. We are what I call ignorant beneficiaries of that upward sloping curve. And the good news is that, kind of people who work in development at the World Bank and other places are estimating that abject poverty will be eliminated by 2030, maybe faster, I think. There'll still be real important work to do, right? That's just escaping the $2 a day mark. We need to keep that accelerating that pace. But it took us 150 years to experience our Industrial Revolution. And when I say we, I mean the West, who experienced it first. Japan experienced theirs in 20 years. So industrial revolutions are fast. That's good news. It's good news. And I think that we can be advocates of why this is important with this biblical background. The other thing I want to show you is that this happens while population growth is going up, increasing. So there's a narrative that begins at the end of the 18th century that I think is still alive and well today. It inspires the modern eugenics movement, which is that people are bad for the planet. And certainly under some circumstances, people can be bad for the planet, right? If we don't figure out a way to make scarce resources more abundant, we will deplete those resources, which is why property rights, I mentioned before, are very important. But what this shows is that people are good for the planet, because people are not just mouths to feed, but their hands to work and their minds to create, and that is what God put us here to do. So advancing human flourishing, I think, starts with understanding the theology of this, understanding the economics of this, and then going out and doing it and being, kind of winsome advocates for it. So I think my time is up. Thank you so much. Appreciate it.